In the Nazi concentration camps, science and cruelty intertwined in unimaginable ways. Doctors in white coats, who should have been protectors of life, became central figures in some of the most shocking and disturbing acts of World War II. In these places, men, women, and children were subjected to experiments that defied the boundaries of humanity and transformed their bodies into mere objects of study. These doctors, backed by the Nazi regime, explored extreme methods and conducted experiments that exceeded any conception of ethics. Their actions left an indelible mark on history, and the details of what occurred in those makeshift laboratories continue to evoke astonishment and horror. What drove these professionals to cross every line of morality? What were the objectives behind these experiments? Eugenics in the concentration camps, the dark side of Nazi science. The Nazi ideology, deeply influenced by eugenics theories, marked a dark chapter in human history. Under the pretext of perfecting the Aryan race, Adolf Hitler and his followers transformed science into a tool of oppression. The concentration camps became human laboratories, where Nazi doctors conducted experiments on prisoners, justifying these actions as a necessary sacrifice for the advancement of genetics. From the beginning of the Third Reich, figures like Heinrich Himmler saw in the concentration camps an opportunity for research unrestricted by ethical considerations. Many Nazi doctors, members of the SS, enjoyed absolute power, alternating between their white coats and black uniforms. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, encouraged the arrival of doctors in the camps, believing they could turn Auschwitz into a center for genetic experimentation. Prisoners of all ages and conditions were used as test subjects. Not only did they endure forced labor, but they were also selected for medical experiments. These often fatal tests ranged from studies on infectious diseases to extreme surgical procedures. The doctors justified these actions as necessary to improve the health and strength of the Aryan race. Major corporations also played a key role in these horrors. Bayer, a subsidiary of the IG Farben conglomerate, used prisoners as test subjects for developing medications. Documents reveal that in 1942, 150 women from Block 10 of Auschwitz were sold to Bayer to test a new anesthetic. None survived. The medical tests were not limited to physical experiments. Julius Hallervorden, a respected Nazi physician, collected nearly 700 brains from individuals killed solely for scientific analysis. These practices were conducted under the regime's protection, with approval from the highest levels of Nazi power. Names like Josef Mengele, Karl Klauberg, and Edward Wirths became synonymous with Nazi medical horrors. Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, conducted particularly atrocious experiments, focusing on twins to study genetics and make comparisons. Klauberg, on the other hand, worked on mass sterilization procedures aimed at preventing the reproduction of those deemed undesirable. Although many of the documents supporting these experiments were destroyed, survivor testimonies and historical records reveal a deeply structured system where science was perverted to serve an ideology. The concentration camps were not only extermination centers, but also laboratories where all boundaries of medical ethics were crossed. The history of Nazi medical experiments remains a reminder of the extremes to which science can go when stripped of humanity and ethical principles. These events underscore the importance of ensuring that medicine is never used as a tool of oppression. The Doctors of Death. Medical experimentation in Nazi camps. In the Nazi concentration camps, doctors became key components of a system that took science to unimaginable extremes. These men, with professional appearances and often charming manners, conducted brutal experiments that turned prisoners into test subjects without consent. Among them, names like Josef Mengele, Karl Klauberg, and Horst Schumann stand out as emblematic figures of a medicine that crossed all ethical boundaries in the name of Nazi ideology. Josef Mengele, one of the most infamous doctors of the Third Reich, arrived at Auschwitz in 1943 at just 32 years old. At first glance, his impeccable appearance and affable behavior could be deceiving. However, behind his spotless SS uniform and smile lay a man obsessed with genetic research, particularly in twins. Mengele sought to discover ways to increase birth rates among women deemed pure Aryan, using Polish and Romani children as test subjects. Mengele's work at Auschwitz included not only experiments on twins, but also inhumane surgical practices performed without anesthesia. The children who survived these tests were killed to allow autopsies, and their bodies were subjected to exhaustive analysis in search of anatomical or genetic differences that might benefit the regime. Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann conducted research in Block 10 of Auschwitz, focusing on developing methods of mass sterilization. Schumann used X-rays in experiments that caused severe burns, internal injuries, and unbearable pain in prisoners. Many died from these tests, while others were left with permanent injuries. Klauberg, for his part, opted for chemical methods, injecting experimental substances into women's uteruses, causing infections, infertility, and often death. Nurses under his command carried out these brutal tasks, ensuring precise injections while doctors observed closely. As chief doctor at Auschwitz, Edward Wirths also oversaw forced experiments on women, focusing on studies of the cervix and reproductive system. His practices were as invasive as those of his colleagues, adding more layers of horror to the Nazi medical experimentation system. Carl Verne, a Danish endocrinologist, implemented a unique experimental project at Buchenwald. He implanted testosterone capsules in homosexual prisoners, promising to convert them into heterosexuals. Although some prisoners claimed the method worked, the results lacked scientific basis, and the project ended abruptly with the war's conclusion in 1945. These doctors, supported by figures like Heinrich Himmler and Rudolf Höss, took medicine to an unimaginable level of cruelty. Their experiments not only caused suffering, but also left a dark legacy of how science can be used as a tool of oppression. Although many documents were destroyed, the testimonies of victims and historical records remind us of the magnitude of the atrocities committed in the name of science. Extreme survival experiments, freezing water and seawater in Nazi camps. During World War II, the Nazi regime sought to push the limits of human endurance through medical experiments aimed at strengthening their soldiers in extreme conditions. In this context, concentration camps like Dachau became laboratories, where prisoners were subjected to tests designed to enhance German combatants' abilities in adverse climates. The experiments involving freezing water and seawater are among the most brutal episodes of this period. Sigmund Rascher, a Bavarian doctor affiliated with the SS, led the freezing experiments for the Luftwaffe. His objective was to identify effective methods for treating hypothermia in pilots shot down over the North Sea. Over 300 prisoners were used in these non-consensual tests. At Dachau, victims were forced to remain naked outdoors for hours in sub-zero temperatures or were submerged in tanks of freezing water. Their vital signs were monitored with electrodes until they reached the brink of death. In the second phase of the experiments, various rewarming techniques were tested, including submersion in hot water. A witness at the Nuremberg trials recounted that some victims were thrown into boiling water, resulting in numerous deaths. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, took a personal interest in these experiments and suggested testing traditional methods to combat extreme cold, such as the use of animal warmth. In one experiment, 4 Romani women were sent to Dachau to warm hypothermic men by lying naked alongside them. These macabre methods reflect the Nazis' obsession with exploring every possible resource to maximize human endurance. Between July and September 1944, Dr. Hans Eppinger led experiments at Dachau aimed at finding ways to make seawater drinkable. Prisoners, primarily Romani, were deprived of food and forced to consume only salt water or filtered water, which caused extreme dehydration and irreversible bodily damage. The subjects weakened rapidly, resorting to licking the ground for moisture. Records indicate that some began consuming wet rags or liquid scraps in a desperate attempt to quench their thirst. Joseph Chofenig, a Holocaust survivor and witness to these experiments, described how prisoners suffered severe health problems and death after days of starvation and consuming salt water. The freezing water and seawater experiments not only highlight the systematic cruelty of the Nazi regime, but also the instrumentalization of science for military purposes. The data collected by doctors like Rascher and Eppinger came at an incalculable human cost and often proved medically useless. These episodes stand as a testament to how far science can go when stripped of ethics, reinforcing the importance of remembering these events to prevent history from repeating itself. The death experiment, explosives and gas in the Nazi solution. In the machinery of Nazi extermination, the obsession with finding more efficient methods of killing led to experiments that combined cruel creativity with available technology. One of the most macabre episodes in this process involved Dr. Albert Widmann, an SS second lieutenant, who sought to minimize the psychological impact of mass killings on the soldiers and guards tasked with carrying them out. In 1941, Widmann was sent to Minsk with the mission of developing new methods of mass killing that would spare the executors the trauma caused by traditional methods. One of his early attempts involved using explosives to eliminate groups of prisoners. In an isolated bunker, several mentally ill patients were placed alongside explosive packages. The result was catastrophic. Although the detonation caused severe damage, it was not enough to kill all the prisoners instantly. Survivors emerged from the bunker crawling and screaming in pain, creating a chaotic and horrifying scene. Body parts were scattered on the ground and hung from trees, while soldiers assigned to clean up threw the remains into the collapsed bunker. This experiment demonstrated that explosives were neither a viable nor efficient method for mass extermination. Widmann abandoned the idea but continued his search for a cleaner method. Inspired by an incident involving the accidental carbon monoxide poisoning of a colleague, Widmann decided to test this gas as a potential extermination method. In the basement of a psychiatric hospital in Mengele, he connected a car exhaust to a sealed room where several patients were placed. However, the initial experiment failed, as the car engine did not produce enough carbon monoxide to kill the victims within a reasonable time. Widmann adjusted the process by replacing the car with a truck, increasing the amount of gas released. This time, the results were deemed successful. The prisoners lost consciousness within a minute and died shortly afterward. This method was celebrated by Heinrich Himmler, who saw carbon monoxide as an efficient tool for mass extermination without affecting the morale of his men. Widmann's experiments laid the groundwork for the development of gas chambers. In 1942, IG Farben introduced Zyklon B, a highly toxic pesticide that became the primary method of extermination in camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek. Between 1942 and 1945, Zyklon B was responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people. In 1947, 9 directors of IG Farben were convicted of war crimes for their involvement in the development and supply of Zyklon B. These events serve as a reminder of the lethal impact of science used without ethics and in service of destructive ideologies. Twins of Auschwitz. Joseph Mengele's scientific obsession. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, made twins the focus of his most notorious experiments at the Auschwitz concentration camp. He believed that unlocking the secrets of twin genetics would allow him to double the Aryan birth rate, an objective he considered key to the expansion of the so-called master race. However, his experiments were driven not only by Nazi ideology, but also by a deep sadism that pushed him beyond every boundary of medical ethics. The twins selected by Mengele underwent extensive medical documentation, including photographs, jaw molds, and fingerprinting. Following this, Mengele conducted experiments ranging from cross-blood transfusions to invasive surgeries and amputations without anesthesia. In some cases, he attempted to physically conjoin twins, sewing their limbs and tissues together to create conjoined twins. When one twin died, Mengele would order the other to be killed so he could perform comparative autopsies, examining how genetic similarities manifested in internal organs. This procedure was repeated with hundreds of pairs of twins, leaving a trail of death and suffering. Eva Moses Kor and her twin sister Miriam were captured and sent to Auschwitz in 1944. At just 10 years old, they became 2 of the many children subjected to Mengele's practices. 3 times a week their arms were strapped down for large amounts of blood to be drawn, while unknown substances were injected into their other arms, causing extreme pain and loss of consciousness. On one occasion, Eva suffered a dangerously high fever caused by an injection, bringing her close to death. Mengele visited her and coldly remarked that he did not expect her to survive more than 2 days. Despite the dire conditions, Eva managed to recover, driven by a determination to protect her sister. She knew that if she died, Miriam would be killed. Scientific horror. Experiments with diseases and deadly chemicals in Nazi camps. Between 1942 and 1945, Nazi concentration camps became centers of medical experimentation where thousands of prisoners were subjected to brutal tests involving deadly diseases and toxic chemicals. These experiments, led by Nazi doctors and supported by the regime, sought medical advancements for the armed forces and testing of treatments for wounds and diseases, sacrificing human lives with no regard for ethics or humanity. At Dachau, over 1,200 prisoners were used to study malaria. Their arms were immobilized inside cages filled with mosquitoes carrying the disease. Once infected, they were treated with extreme doses of synthetic drugs, some so high that they proved fatal. More than half of the subjects died, while the survivors were left with severe long-term effects. Oswald Pohl, chief administrator of the camps, described these experiments as the most extensive of their kind under his command, suggesting the number of victims may have been even higher. Between 1943 and 1945, the camps of Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler became epicenters for testing viral hepatitis, then known as epidemic jaundice. Prisoners were deliberately infected to develop vaccines for German troops. Most victims died, and those who survived endured extreme suffering before being replaced by new subjects for further experiments. At Buchenwald, from 1943 to 1944, experiments investigated the effects of lethal poisons administered in food and fired from poisoned bullets. Victims who did not die immediately were executed so detailed autopsies could be performed. Photographs and meticulous records documented the impact of the chemicals, including images of bodies marked with boils filled with black fluid resulting from poison injections. From 1939 to 1945, prisoners in camps like Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück were exposed to mustard gas and corrosive chemicals to study the resulting wounds. These burns were deliberately worsened and treated with experimental medications to identify effective therapies. At Buchenwald, victims suffered burns caused by phosphorus extracted from incendiary bombs, part of efforts to improve medical care for soldiers on the front lines. At Ravensbrück, sulfonamide experiments involved creating artificial wounds infected with dangerous bacteria, such as tetanus. Victims' blood vessels were tied off to simulate battle injuries, while their wounds were aggravated with wood splinters and glass. These experiments sought to evaluate the effectiveness of antimicrobial treatments, but left a legacy of mutilation and death. These experiments not only caused immense suffering and death to thousands of prisoners, but also demonstrated how science was weaponized to commit atrocities under the guise of medical advancement. These events remain a stark reminder of the horrific consequences of stripping science of ethics and humanity. Death chambers and altitude. The experiments of Hubertus Strughold and Sigmund Rascher. During World War II, the high-altitude experiments conducted at Dachau concentration camp marked one of the darkest chapters in Nazi scientific history. Under the direction of Sigmund Rascher and with the backing of Hubertus Strughold, these inhumane trials sought to understand the physiological effects of high altitudes on German pilots. However, behind these medical objectives lay atrocious practices that sacrificed hundreds of lives. In 1942, prisoners at Dachau were placed in low-pressure chambers that simulated altitudes of up to 21,000 meters, 68,000 feet. These tests, designed to replicate the conditions faced by pilots ejected from their aircraft, proved fatal for most subjects. Of the 200 prisoners used, 80 died during the experiments, and the remainder were executed to perform autopsies. Rascher meticulously documented the victims' reactions as their bodies struggled to survive without oxygen. In a letter to Heinrich Himmler, he described how a 37-year-old man experienced convulsions, lost consciousness, and ultimately died after 30 minutes of oxygen deprivation. This cold and impersonal medical record underscores the callousness with which these experiments were carried out. While Rascher executed these experiments, he operated under the orders of Hubertus Strughold, a prominent physiologist and the Luftwaffe's chief of aeromedical research. Strughold, later dubbed the father of space medicine, oversaw studies that included oxygen deprivation tests on epileptic children transferred from a euthanasia center to his laboratory in Berlin. Although these children survived, the experiments aimed to simulate the effects of hypoxia, a common danger at extreme altitudes. Strughold was brought to the United States in 1947 as part of Operation Paperclip, a program designed to leverage the expertise of German scientists for the Allied powers. During his time at NASA, he was celebrated for his contributions to space medicine. However, later investigations in 2004 revealed his involvement in wartime experiments, leading the Aerospace Medical Association to rescind an award bearing his name. While Rascher was arrested in 1944 for fraud and executed shortly before the war's end, Strughold eluded justice for decades. His story symbolizes how science, stripped of ethics, can be wielded to justify atrocities. The high-altitude experiments conducted at Dachau and Strughold's laboratories not only caused the death and suffering of hundreds of people, but also left a chilling legacy of the extremes science can reach when divorced from humanity. These atrocious practices remain a stark reminder of the need to keep ethics at the core of scientific research. Science at the limit. Nazi experiments on women at Ravensbrück. During World War II, Ravensbrück, a concentration camp for women, became a site of horrifying experiments that sought to implement policies of racial hygiene, explore the limits of the human body, and develop surgical and chemical methods aligned with Nazi ideals. Forced sterilization was a top medical priority for the Nazi regime, aimed at preventing the reproduction of those deemed unfit by the standards of the Third Reich. Women at Ravensbrück were subjected to invasive surgical procedures, including ovary removal and tubal ligation. These operations, performed in unsanitary conditions and without proper anesthesia, caused severe infections, chronic pain, and in many cases death. In addition, Nazi doctors experimented with chemical methods, injecting substances into reproductive organs. These chemicals destroyed ovarian tissue, causing severe inflammation and leaving victims sterile. Radiation experiments were another method. Women were exposed to high doses of radiation in the pelvic area, leading to severe burns, radiation poisoning, and cancer in survivors. The goal of these experiments was to find rapid, cost-effective, and scalable solutions, reflecting the systematic approach of the regime toward racial hygiene. Pregnant women were also subjected to experimentation at Ravensbrück. Some were allowed to carry their pregnancies to term under extreme conditions, such as severe malnutrition and lack of medical care, to study the effects on fetal development and maternal health. In other cases, forced abortions were performed without anesthesia, causing irreversible physical and psychological damage. These procedures aimed not only to terminate pregnancies, but also to test new abortion techniques and experimental drugs. Fetuses extracted during these operations were used for further research, serving as tools to fulfill the regime's scientific objectives. The camp also became a site for experiments with dangerous chemicals and bacteria. Prisoners were injected with toxic compounds into their tissues to observe the effects. These tests caused severe infections and permanent injuries. In other cases, they were deliberately exposed to infectious diseases like tetanus, simulating battle wound conditions, to evaluate the effectiveness of experimental treatments. Biological experiments extended to tests with antimicrobial agents like sulfonamide, used on wounds deliberately contaminated with bacteria and foreign substances like glass and wood. These scenarios simulated war injuries, turning Ravensbrück into a laboratory for developing battlefield medical treatments. The women subjected to these experiments suffered devastating health consequences. Many were left permanently sterile, while others endured chronic infections, persistent pain, and severe psychological trauma. Ravensbrück became a place where prisoners were reduced to medical study tools, stripped of all humanity. After the war, the experiments conducted at Ravensbrück and other camps were exposed during the Nuremberg trials. The doctors responsible faced charges for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and some were convicted. However, many escaped justice, leaving a legacy of impunity and suffering. These trials led to the establishment of ethical standards in medical research, such as the Nuremberg Code, designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. Ravensbrück and the experiments conducted there stand as a testament to the extreme science can reach when ethics are abandoned. Manipulating human genetics, the Nazi experiments to shape the Aryan race. Under the Nazi regime, concentration camps became centers of medical experimentation where inhumane practices were carried out to support the ideology of Aryan superiority. These experiments sought to alter prisoners' physical characteristics and justify genocidal policies through pseudo-scientific practices that reflected the extreme misuse of science for political and racial purposes. One of the most infamous procedures conducted by the Nazis was the attempt to change eye color to fit the Aryan racial ideal, represented by bright blue eyes. This experiment, led primarily by Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, involved injecting chemical pigments directly into the eyes of children and adults. Survivors' accounts described the procedure as incredibly painful, causing severe inflammation, permanent blindness, and in many cases, death due to untreated infections. Despite these atrocities, the experiments failed to achieve any significant alteration in eye color, underscoring their scientific futility. However, these practices were meticulously documented as part of the Nazis' efforts to justify their obsession with racial purity. Simultaneously, Nazi doctors conducted anatomical and physiological studies on prisoners from various ethnic groups, particularly Jews, Romani, and Slavs. These investigations included exhaustive measurements of victims' bodies, comparing their physical traits to the Aryan standards defined by the Nazis. The most brutal practices involved live dissections performed without anesthesia to observe the internal functioning of organs and systems under extreme conditions. Prisoners underwent invasive surgical procedures, followed by detailed analyses that lacked scientific merit, but were used to reinforce narratives of racial inferiority. In one documented case, prisoners' limbs were amputated to study tissue healing and regeneration under various conditions. These experiments caused unbearable pain and often resulted in the victims' deaths. Prominent figures, such as Ottmar von Verschuer, used these studies to legitimize policies of extermination and systematic discrimination. The purpose of these experiments was not to advance medical science, but to bolster Nazi ideology. Every result was manipulated to validate the belief that certain groups were biologically inferior, thereby justifying their persecution and extermination. The data obtained were collected and presented as scientific evidence at conferences and in publications within the Reich to strengthen the narrative of Aryan supremacy. After the war, the Nuremberg trials exposed the horrors committed in the name of science to the world. While many Nazi doctors and scientists were convicted of war crimes, others evaded justice and continued their careers in various countries. These experiments exemplify how science, stripped of ethics, can become a tool to justify oppression and genocide. Today, the horrors of the concentration camps serve as a reminder of the importance of keeping humanity and ethics at the core of scientific research. In the Nazi concentration camps, science was transformed into a tool of oppression and cruelty, where doctors who were supposed to protect life committed inhumane acts in the name of a distorted ideology. These medical experiments not only stripped men, women, and children of their dignity and humanity, but also left deep physical and psychological scars on the victims. The Nazi obsession with eugenics and Aryan superiority led to genetic manipulation and atrocious practices that defied all ethical boundaries. The Nuremberg trials were a crucial milestone in condemning these crimes and establishing fundamental ethical principles in medical research, emphasizing the importance of respecting human rights and the dignity of every individual. However, the legacy of impunity for many of these doctors and the later use of some of their findings highlight the complexities of post-war justice.